I'm Charlie Creme, and this is my bracket. In Region 1 in Albany, South Carolina the favorite to win it all. We're going to move the Gamecocks along pretty easily there. 8-9 matchup. Let's go with Michigan State over North Carolina. 5-12, always an interesting one. Florida Gulf Coast has won 2 first-round games as 12 seeds already in the last 2 years. We're going to do it for a third time. And then we're going to have Indiana moving on against 31-1 Fairfield. So let's move down to the bottom of Albany 1. And we're going to have Nebraska moving on against Texas A&M. A little chalk there. Same with Oregon State moving on. Ole Miss. We'll talk more about the Rebels later. They're a sleeper pick for me, and they're going to play Notre Dame in round 2. So let's now move on to Portland 4, and Texas top seed easily will move on against the Drexel Dragons. Alabama, Florida State, another good matchup, an 8-9. We're going to go with the Crimson Tide, and Utah is going to move on against South Dakota State, but that should be a real good ball game. Gonzaga playing at home, a mid-major getting first-round games at home. They'll move on to play Utah in round 2. Now we got the bottom half of the Regional 4 in Portland, and this is another good game, 6-11, but I think Tennessee's size will dictate that one, and they will move on. NC State advances against Chattanooga, and I'm going to go with Iowa State over Maryland in another, I think, marquee matchup in this tournament, and Stanford easily over Norfolk State. So now we continue with round 1, moving into the Albany 2 regional, and I think everybody knows Caitlin Clark is going to move on to round 2 there pretty easily. Let's go with Princeton, an Ivy League victory to move on to round 2, and I'm going to pick Drake as a 12-5 upset to get Colorado. And the Bulldogs move on, and then Kansas State playing at home, they're going to move on as well. Now, the bottom half of that bracket gives us another real good 6-11 matchup, but I think Louisville is going to prevail. Jeff Walls' teams have made 5 straight Elite Eights. They might not do that this year, but I think they're going to get through round 1. LSU easily moves on, and UNLV pulls a slight upset and beats Creighton, and UCLA should have no problem moving on to round 2. Now we move on to the Regional 3 in Portland. USC, the top seed. Juju Watkins, no problems there moving through. Kansas advances as the 8 seed over the 9 Michigan. And we're going to go with Baylor over Vanderbilt, making their first tournament appearance in 10 years, but it'll be a short one. And Virginia Tech, even with the injury to Liz Kitley, we're not sure whether she's playing or not, but I still think they're good enough to advance to round 2. The final first-round matchups, the bottom of that bracket, I think Arizona is going to pull a surprise. That'd be 2 wins for the Wildcats in this tournament after barely getting in. UConn over Jackson State in Stores. I think Duke will move on against Richmond, and then Ohio State over Maine to get through to round 2. Now let's go back and start our round 2 predictions back in Albany, South Carolina. Still easily moving on against a game Michigan State team, but it's still South Carolina all the way there. And I think Indiana will prevail and beat Florida Gulf Coast. Double-digit seeds don't often get to the second or to the Sweet 16 in the women's game. Oregon State going to be good enough to beat Nebraska. And Ole Miss, the 7, I mentioned them, there's a sleeper. They're going to knock off a Notre Dame team depleted by some injuries and having some trouble with depth. So Ole Miss moves on. Let's go to the second round. In Portland, Texas should have still no trouble moving on past Alabama. I think Gonzaga, playing at home in Spokane, pulls a bit of a surprise, I suppose, mid-major over a Pac-12 team to move on into the Sweet 16. And I think Tennessee is playing really well right now, and they're going to get to the Sweet 16 as well. Go with Stanford in a high-scoring game against Iowa State to move on. Now we got our round 2 matchups in the other Albany regional, and we're going to keep moving Caitlin Clark and Iowa along, and they're going to match up with Kansas State in that Sweet 16. They played twice this year, so it should be an interesting matchup there. And then LSU prevails over Louisville. Not another Elite Eight for Jeff Walls, and UCLA gets the 2-3 matchup that I think we're all anticipating into the Sweet 16. Now let's go to Portland 3 and USC. We're going to move them along as well. They're playing good basketball at the end of the year, won the Pac-12 tournament. Baylor is going to beat Virginia Tech. I don't know about Liz Kitley. I'm feeling like she's not going to play, and that's going to make Baylor the favorite in that game. UConn certainly moves on to the Sweet 16 over Arizona, and we've got Ohio State in that full court press being too much for Duke. So now we've arrived at our Sweet 16 matchups in Albany, South Carolina. Again, too much for Indiana. Ole Miss, another surprise for the Rebels, and they're going to move on to play SEC foe South Carolina. Texas moves on against Gonzaga, the number 1 seed, and a little bit of chalk here. Stanford, the 1 and the 2, are going to move on there. And now let's move forward to the Sweet 16 back in Albany. As I said, Iowa and Kansas State played each other twice in the regular season. They split, but Iowa is going to get the rubber match and move on to the Elite Eight. LSU, UCLA, this might be the game of the tournament thus far. I'm moving the Bruins along to take out the defending champs. We've got USC and Baylor. The Trojans keep chugging along and get to the Elite Eight, and UConn will join them in that Elite Eight matchup. Now we've got our marquee games. We're into the Elite Eight. South Carolina, Ole Miss. Gamecocks' path was pretty easy set up, and I think they're going to make the Final Four fairly comfortably. This is another one of those big-time games. I think it goes right down to the last possession, and I'm going to pick Stanford to move on to another Final Four. And we've got a big 1-2 matchup, Iowa-UCLA, and I'm picking the Bruins with the better defense to move on to the Final Four. USC and UConn. UConn's playing with about 6 players, but I think they would have the secret formula to take down Juju Watkins and the Trojans, and I'm putting UConn back in the Final Four after missing it last year. So now that brings us to our Final Four. Heavyweight teams here. South Carolina, Stanford. I'm moving South Carolina into the championship game. 32-0 coming in, and they're still going to be undefeated heading into the national championship game. And UCLA, long considered earlier in the season the second best team of the country, they're going to prove it by getting to the championship game. So it's down to South Carolina and UCLA, a matchup back in December I think a lot of us thought we were going to see. But lo and behold, South Carolina has been the best team all season, and the Gamecocks are my ultimate champion.